I stood alone at Union Station, clutching my suitcase with trembling hands as my children's car disappeared around the corner. At 72 years old, I'd been abandoned 300 miles from home with nothing but $50 and the clothes on my back. What my ungrateful children didn't know was that I'd been 3 steps ahead of them all along. My name is Frank Morrison, and at 72 years old, I thought I knew my children pretty well. Turns out I was dead wrong about that. 6 months ago, I buried my Margaret after 48 beautiful years of marriage, and suddenly my 3 kids started treating me like a problem that needed solving. The funny thing is, they had no idea their old man was still sharp enough to see right through their little scheme. I'm a retired electrical engineer from Cleveland, spent my whole career making sure the lights stayed on for other people. Margaret and I, we saved every penny we could. Our modest house might not look like much from the outside, but it's worth $400,000, and we've got another $400,000 tucked away in savings. Not bad for a couple of working-class folks who never forgot where they came from. David's 45 now, my oldest boy. Susan's 42, always been the emotional one. And Michael, my baby at 38, though he's got kids of his own. Used to be, they'd visit every Sunday after church. Margaret would make her famous pot roast, and we'd argue about politics and baseball like normal families do. Well, that all changed the day we put Margaret in the ground. Suddenly, every conversation became about my situation. They'd huddle in corners, whispering about what I should consider for my future. David kept bringing up senior living communities with names like Sunset Manor and Golden Years Village. Makes sense, right? Except these places cost more per month than most people make in salary, and my kids were acting like they were doing me some kind of favor by suggesting them. The weird part is how they thought I couldn't hear them. Maybe they figured grief had made me deaf or stupid. I'd catch fragments of their hushed conversations during visits. "Dad's getting too independent for his own good," Susan would say. "We need to think about our options," David would add. Options, like I was a stock portfolio they needed to manage. Then there's the little digital recorder Margaret gave me last Christmas. She wanted me to start working on my memoirs, said our grandkids deserved to know their family history. Smart woman, my Margaret. Smarter than she knew, because that little device became my insurance policy. Every family visit, every phone call, every concerned conversation about my welfare got recorded. Amazing what people will say when they think nobody's listening. The real turning point came 3 weeks ago. David called, practically bubbling with excitement about a surprise birthday trip they were planning. All 3 kids had pooled their resources to give their dear old dad something special. A trip back to Springfield, where I grew up. "You deserve this, Pop," he said, voice thick with emotion I hadn't heard since Margaret's funeral. "We want to make some new memories with you." Let's not forget, these are the same kids who hadn't coordinated a birthday card in 5 years, much less an actual trip. But I played along, told them how touched I was by their thoughtfulness. Meanwhile, I kept that recorder running during every planning call. Funny how their story kept changing. First, it was Springfield for my birthday. Then, it became a healing journey to help me process grief. Eventually, Susan let slip something about taking care of everything while I was away. That's when I knew for certain what my children were really planning. They weren't taking me on any birthday trip. They were removing an obstacle, the old man who stood between them and their inheritance, the burden who insisted on living independently in a house they had already mentally divided among themselves. But here's what David, Susan, and Michael didn't count on. Their father might be grieving, but he wasn't stupid, and he definitely wasn't going down without a fight. The day they came to pick me up for our special trip was when their real education began. The morning they picked me up, all 3 of my children were acting like they'd won the lottery. David arrived first in his shiny SUV, practically bouncing on his heels as he loaded my suitcase. Susan kept dabbing at her eyes with tissues, claiming she was just so happy we were doing this together. Michael couldn't stop fidgeting with his phone, checking messages every 30 seconds like he was coordinating some kind of military operation. "This is going to be so special, Dad," Susan kept saying as we pulled out of my driveway. "You're going to love what we have planned." The funny thing about lies is how much energy they take to maintain. My kids were working overtime to seem excited, but I could feel the tension crackling in that car like a live wire. David's knuckles were white on the steering wheel. Susan's cheerful chatter had a forced quality that reminded me of a badly tuned radio. And Michael? Poor Michael looked like he might throw up. 2 hours into the drive, I started noticing we weren't heading toward Springfield at all. Highway signs kept pointing toward Indianapolis, which was definitely not where I grew up. When I mentioned this little geographical discrepancy, David laughed it off. "We're taking the scenic route, Pop. Trust us on this one." Trust. That word hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. The real tell was when Susan's phone rang and she answered it in a whisper. "Yes, everything's going according to plan," she said, glancing nervously at me in the rearview mirror. "We should be there by 2 o'clock. Then she caught my eye and flushed red as a stop sign. "Oh, that was just the hotel," confirming our reservation. Hotels don't usually require progress reports on guest arrivals, but I kept that observation to myself. My little recorder was getting quite the workout, safely tucked in my jacket pocket where my thoughtful children couldn't see it. 4 hours after leaving Cleveland, we pulled into Union Station in Indianapolis. Not a hotel, not a scenic overlook, a train station in a city I'd never had any reason to visit. David parked near the main entrance and turned around with that same fake smile he'd been wearing all morning. "Okay, Dad, here's where things get exciting. We need you to wait here with your suitcase while we go handle some arrangements inside. It's all part of the surprise." Susan leaned over and gave me what I now realize was meant to be a final hug. She was crying real tears this time, not the manufactured emotion from earlier. "I love you, Daddy," she whispered. "Please remember that no matter what happens." Michael practically threw himself out of the car without saying goodbye at all. Kid always was terrible at hiding his feelings. They unloaded my suitcase, set it beside me on the sidewalk, and David handed me an envelope. "There's $50 in there, Pop, for expenses. We'll be back in just a little while." Then they drove away. Just like that. 47 years of bedtime stories, little league games, school plays, and family dinners, and they drove away like I was a bag of garbage they'd finally worked up the courage to dump. The first hour, I kept telling myself there had to be some explanation. Maybe this really was part of some elaborate surprise. Maybe they were picking up other family members or arranging something special that required secrecy. The second hour, reality started sinking in like water into a leaky boat. By the third hour, when a security guard approached me with genuine concern about the elderly man who'd been sitting alone on a bench with his luggage, I understood exactly what my children had done to me. "You okay, sir? You've been here quite a while." I tried calling David, straight to voicemail. Susan's phone went to voicemail too. Michael had apparently turned his off entirely. 3 children, and suddenly none of them could be reached. What are the odds? The security guard, a kind young man named Marcus, helped me understand my options. There was a homeless shelter 6 blocks away. Adult Protective Services could be called. The police could file a report. None of these options sounded particularly appealing to a man who'd spent 72 years taking care of himself. Thank you very much. "There's a diner across the street," Marcus suggested gently. "Rosa, who works there, she's good people. Maybe grab some coffee, think things through." The diner was one of those old-fashioned places that serves breakfast all day and doesn't judge you for ordering pie before noon. Rosa turned out to be a woman about Susan's age, with kind eyes and the sort of no-nonsense attitude that reminded me of Margaret. When I explained my situation, she poured me coffee without asking and slid a piece of apple pie across the counter. "Your own kids did this to you?" She shook her head in disgust. "Honey, that's lower than snake belly." Over the next 2 hours, Rosa helped me process what had happened and figure out what came next. Turns out I wasn't completely helpless after all. Sure, I only had $50 in cash, but my credit cards were still in my wallet. My bank account was still active. My brain still worked just fine, despite what my children apparently believed. But here's where the story gets interesting, and where my dear departed Margaret's advice about always having a backup plan finally paid off. See, Rosa thought she was helping me figure out how to survive this betrayal. What she didn't know was that I'd been preparing for exactly this scenario for weeks. The recordings I'd made weren't just evidence of my children's conspiracy. They were insurance. And the house they were probably already planning to sell? Well, that was going to be their first surprise. The bank account they thought they'd inherit. Another surprise waiting for them back in Cleveland. While I sat in that diner, sipping coffee and eating pie with a woman who'd shown me more kindness in 2 hours than my own children had managed in 6 months, I was already 3 moves ahead in a game they didn't even know we were playing yet. Rosa helped me find a decent hotel room within walking distance. Nothing fancy, but clean and safe. As I checked in using a credit card my children had no idea existed, I couldn't help smiling at the thought of what they'd find when they finally worked up the courage to go back to my house. The real education was about to begin, and this time, I'd be the one doing the teaching. My children thought they were abandoning a helpless old man. What they'd actually done was unleash someone with nothing left to lose and all the motivation in the world to make them pay for their betrayal. The next morning would bring phone calls that would change everything. But first, I had some arrangements of my own to make. From my hotel room that first night, I made a phone call that would change everything. James Morrison, Margaret's nephew and my attorney for the past 15 years, answered on the second ring. "Frank, how did the trip go?" "About as well as we expected," I said, settling into the worn armchair by the window. "They dumped me at Union Station just like we figured they would." James had been helping me prepare for this moment ever since I'd played him those first recordings 3 weeks ago. Smart kid, law degree from Northwestern, and more importantly, he actually gave a damn about family. Unlike some people I could mention. "Are you ready to pull the trigger on everything?" he asked. "Light the fuse, James, all of it." What my children didn't know was that their dear old dad had been restructuring his entire estate for weeks. That $800,000 in savings and assets, already transferred to the Margaret Morrison Foundation for Elder Care, a charity I'd established in my wife's memory. The house they were probably already measuring for new furniture, listed for sale yesterday morning with the proceeds earmarked for the foundation. But here's the beautiful part. I hadn't just moved money around. Those hours of recorded conversations were sitting in James's office, documenting every detail of their conspiracy. David discussing the Frank problem, Susan mentioning state facilities, Michael's charming comment about finally getting access to the house, all of it preserved for posterity. "The bank transfers went through this morning," James reported. "Your accounts are closed, everything's moved to the foundation. The house listing goes live tomorrow." "And the media contacts?" "Standing by. Channel 19 wants an exclusive interview. The plain dealer is interested in the story. Social media is already buzzing from the preview we leaked." Meanwhile, back in Cleveland, my children were probably sleeping peacefully, convinced they'd solved their inheritance problem. David would be planning renovations to my house. Susan would be calculating her share of the money. Michael would be telling his wife they could finally afford that new car. Their wake-up call came at 6:30 a.m. when David's phone rang. First National Bank calling to inform him that Frank Morrison's accounts had been closed and all assets transferred. David probably dropped his coffee mug right there in his kitchen. I'd love to have seen his face. By 8 a.m., David was racing across town to my house, Susan and Michael following behind in their own cars. What they found was my neighbor Jerry hanging a for sale sign in the front yard. "Jerry, what the hell's going on?" David must have shouted. "Frank hired me to handle the sale," Jerry replied. "Didn't you kids know? He's moving to Indianapolis, donating everything to some charity for old folks." That's when my phone started ringing. 12 missed calls in 2 hours. Voice messages that progressed from confused to panicked to absolutely furious. Susan crying about Dad's mental state. Michael demanding I call him immediately. David threatening legal action. None of them had figured out the best part yet. James scheduled my television interview for Thursday afternoon. Channel 19's studio in Indianapolis, where I'd tell the whole story. The abandoned elderly father, the conspiracy recordings, the children who tried to steal his inheritance while dumping him like garbage. "We're calling it Abandoned a Father's Story," the producer told me. "This is exactly the kind of human interest piece that resonates with viewers." Rosa from the diner came to watch the taping. Turned out she had 3 kids of her own and couldn't imagine treating any parent the way mine had treated me. "You're doing the right thing, Frank," she said. "Other families need to hear this story." The interview aired Friday night. By Saturday morning, the story had gone viral. Comments poured in from people sharing their own experiences with ungrateful children and elder abandonment. Donations started flooding into the Margaret Morrison Foundation from complete strangers who'd been moved by the story. My children called the local news station, demanding a retraction. Too late for that. The foundation exploded beyond anything I could have imagined. Within 2 months, we'd raised over $3 million from people who understood exactly what it felt like to be thrown away by their own families. Margaret would have been proud. My children tried everything. David hired a lawyer to challenge my mental competency. Failed miserably when James presented those crystal-clear recordings of their conspiracy. Susan attempted a tearful apology on social media. Nobody bought it after hearing her discuss taking care of the Frank problem in her own voice. Michael went completely silent, which was probably his smartest move. The legal consequences came swift and hard. Elder abandonment is a felony in 3 states, including Indiana. The district attorney's office filed charges after the story broke. My children faced serious jail time and crushing legal fees. They had to sell their own homes to pay for lawyers who couldn't undo what they'd done. But here's what really got them. The social ostracism hurt worse than any courtroom drama. Their friends stopped calling. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid them. Michael's wife filed for divorce, taking the kids. Susan lost her job at the insurance company when clients started requesting different agents. David's construction business dried up overnight when customers discovered he was one of those Morrison kids from the news. Christmas morning found me volunteering at the foundation's first crisis center. Rosa had quit the diner to become our intake coordinator. We'd helped 43 abandoned elderly people find housing, health care, and hope. Real purpose, the kind Margaret always said mattered more than money. My phone rang at noon, David's number. I almost didn't answer. "Dad?" His voice cracked like he was 12 years old again. "I know you probably don't want to talk to me, but you're right," I said calmly. "I don't. We made a terrible mistake. We were scared you'd lose everything if something happened, and you thought wrong. Amazing how clear everything becomes when you stop making excuses for people. You threw me away like garbage because you wanted my money. Now you're broke and desperate. Funny how that works." 3 years later, I'm still in Indianapolis. Found myself a nice retirement community where people actually enjoy each other's company. The foundation has helped over 500 families navigate elder care crises. We've got chapters in 12 states now. My children learned something valuable. Sometimes the family you choose treats you better than the family you're born with. They chose money over love. I chose dignity over blood relations. Margaret always said the best revenge is living well. She was right about that too.